Victoria, you will return home.
I cannot. I serve here now.
You will obey me in
By
silence.
the time Victoria
She is
Lennox's
not
brother
yours to command.
rode into the forecourt of Warrington Hall, rain had already silvered the stone steps and turned the autumn gravel black. The household gathered because raised male voices still traveled through a mourning house faster than prayer. Footmen hovered beneath the portico. The butler stood near the inner doors with the controlled face of a man determined not to let disorder become spectacle. Two maids watched from the edge of the hall, one with flour on her apron, the other with lamp oil on her cuff. Above them, halfway down the staircase, a solemn boy stood with one hand gripping the banister, while a little girl hid herself against his side. And at the center of it all stood Clara Winters, the quiet governess in plain gray wool, careful gloves, and a face composed by long practice. Only her hands betrayed her. They trembled once, then went still. "Her name is not Clara Winters," Nathaniel Lennox said. Rain gleamed on the shoulders of his riding coat. "Her name is Victoria Lennox. She is my sister, and she has no right to be here under false pretenses. She fled my house, stole funds that did not belong to her, and abandoned a marriage arrangement entered for her good. I have come to take her home." He did not shout. Men like Nathaniel did not need to. He had the polished cruelty of a man who had learned that control looked more respectable when wrapped in grammar and restraint. He was 34, handsome in the cold, symmetrical way that made strangers trust him too quickly, and every inch of him carried the assurance of a man who had rarely been forced to explain himself. Victoria did not answer at once. She had grown up under that voice. She knew its favorite rhythm. Accusation first, certainty second, humiliation last. Nathaniel took one step nearer. "Come down," he said. "You have embarrassed yourself enough. Lord Sutterfield has shown more patience than you deserve. You will return with me, apologize, and do what should have been done months ago." Above the stair, little Eliza Warrington gave a broken sound. Her brother Thomas tightened his arm around her shoulders. Neither child looked at Nathaniel. They looked at Victoria with the terrible, speechless fear children reserve for the moment safety begins to leave a room. Victoria lifted her chin. "I will not go with you." A small stillness fell over the hall. Nathaniel smiled as though indulging a familiar defect. "There is the family stubbornness," he said. "You always did mistake ingratitude for principle." The front doors remained open behind him. Wet wind moved through the hall and stirred the black mourning ribbon tied to the portrait of the late Duchess of Warrington. 3 months had passed since Helena Warrington's burial, yet the whole house still seemed arranged around absence. Curtains were opened because light was expected to be useful, though no one quite believed it. Meals were served because bodies required feeding, though appetite had not returned in earnest. The children wore mourning less from custom than because sorrow had become their natural color. It had taken Victoria 6 weeks to make them laugh at all. It had taken 8 to make Eliza speak above a whisper. It had taken longer still for Edmund Warrington, Duke of Warrington, to stop looking at every small kindness as if it were one more thing he might fail to protect. Now he came into the hall from the west corridor, estate papers still in one hand as though he had risen from work rather than crisis. He was a tall man with dark hair, grave gray eyes, and the severe, disciplined face of someone who had not allowed grief to make him dramatic, only quieter and more exacting. Mourning had pared him down until only the essential remained. He looked first at Nathaniel, then at Victoria, and finally, with the speed of a father who measured danger by the children nearest it, at the staircase. "What is this?" he asked. Nathaniel turned with immediate elegance, already preparing the posture of the wronged gentleman. "Your Grace, I regret the disturbance. I am Nathaniel Lennox. This woman entered your house under a false name. She is my sister. She fled her family obligations, stole money, and has been hiding here as a servant. I have come to take her home." Victoria saw the slightest change in the Duke's expression at the word servant. Not offense, recognition. He was a man who noticed when language was used as a weapon. "She is my children's governess," he said, "and she will answer for herself." Nathaniel's smile thinned. With respect, family matters belong to family. Thomas spoke before anyone else could. "No." Every head turned. Since his mother's death, the boy had used words sparingly, as if speech cost more than silence. Yet now he came down 2 steps farther, pale with the effort of courage. "She stays," Thomas said. "You cannot take her." Eliza gripped the banister with both hands. "Please," she whispered. The sound of her voice, small and cracked, but unmistakable, moved through the hall like light through broken glass. Edmund turned fully toward his daughter. Whatever he had been prepared to say changed at once. He crossed the floor with controlled speed and stopped at the foot of the stairs, one hand lifted but not touching, as if he understood that grief made sudden tenderness hard to bear. "Eliza," he said. She looked not at him, but at Victoria. "If he takes her," she whispered, "the house will go dark again." No one moved. Nathaniel recovered first. "A touching scene," he said. "Yet surely your Grace understands that affection from children does not erase fraud. My sister has always been theatrical when cornered. She was promised in marriage to a respectable gentleman whose offer would have secured her future and helped relieve debts left by our late father. Instead, she disappeared, leaving scandal behind her. I am merely repairing what she damaged. Future, respectable, debts." Victoria heard those words exactly as she had heard them all her life. Purchase, age, excuse. She might still have faltered if Edmund had looked at her with suspicion first. He did not. He looked at Nathaniel as one man looks at another when deciding whether insult has become threat. "What funds were stolen?" he asked. Nathaniel blinked. "I beg your pardon?" "You said she stole money. How much?" "A private amount." "How much?" Edmund repeated. The silence sharpened. Nathaniel gave a short laugh. "Surely that is beneath your notice. Not when you enter my house accusing one of my employees of theft." There it was. Not protection born of sentiment, protection born of order. Nathaniel had expected rank to support ownership. He had not expected it to demand proof. £40, Nathaniel said at last. "It was my mother's dowry money," Victoria said, "hidden in the false bottom of her cedar chest. She wrote to me about it before she died." Nathaniel's face remained composed. Only his eyes changed. "She lies." "Then produce the account book that proves otherwise," Edmund replied. Nathaniel turned back to him. "You cannot mean to interfere in this." "I mean," said the Duke, "that no woman leaves this house under accusation without evidence, and no distressed person is removed from my children's sight by force while I govern here." Wet wind crossed the threshold. One of the maids drew a ragged breath of relief and tried to hide it as a cough. Nathaniel took a slow breath. "Then I will return with a magistrate." "Return as you please." Edmund's voice never rose. "But until then, Miss Winters, or Miss Lennox, if that is her preference, remains under my protection." Nathaniel looked at Victoria, and for the first time the mask slipped enough for her to see the old danger plainly. "This is not finished," he said. "No," she answered. "It never was." He left with rain on his boots and fury hidden beneath polish. Only when the hoofbeats faded beyond the drive did the house begin to breathe again. If stories like this move you, leave your like beneath the candlelight and subscribe to Quiet Fires of America, where the unwanted are not always left unclaimed. Eliza came down the stairs at once and threw herself into Victoria's skirts with such desperate force that Victoria nearly lost her balance. Thomas followed more slowly, because Thomas had lately become careful with every feeling, but he came too, standing near enough that his sleeve brushed hers as if he needed to confirm she remained real. Edmund said nothing for several seconds. He only turned to the butler. "Mr. Price, the doors." They were shut at once. The wind disappeared. The house was still in mourning, still bruised, still heavy with what could not yet be repaired. Yet the hall felt altered now, as if some line no one had wished to cross had been crossed and survived. Victoria bent and held Eliza carefully. "I am all right," she murmured. Eliza shook her head against her gown. "You are not." It was one of the truest things anyone had said all season. Edmund dismissed the servants with a glance so they might leave without appearing to flee. Then he addressed Victoria directly. "Come to the library when the children are settled," he said. "You will tell me everything." He did not soften the instruction. He did not need to. Something gentler lay beneath it, and because he never used gentleness cheaply, it struck her harder. Victoria had come to Warrington Hall under the name Clara Winters in the last hot week of August, when the fields still smelled of sun and dust, but the evening light had begun leaning toward autumn. She arrived with one modest trunk, a letter of reference from a widow in Williamsburg who had once known her mother, and a heart so exhausted by vigilance that every unfamiliar kindness felt suspicious. The advertisement had described the position simply: governess required at once for 2 children recently bereaved. Discretion essential. Applicants need strong French, music, penmanship, and patience. Victoria possessed all these and a desperation she did not write down. The Lennox family had once called itself honorable. It was old enough, connected enough, and proud enough to mean the word only in public. After their father died, Nathaniel inherited the house, the accounts, the authority, and the habit of believing that because he now fed the household, he therefore owned its breathing. He did not strike where bruises showed. That would have been vulgar. He preferred the more durable humiliations, controlling correspondence, delaying dress allowances, turning servants into informants, calling objections feminine agitation, and praising women only when they were obedient enough to be useful. When their mother attempted to challenge his handling of certain funds, he began describing her as forgetful in company. When she became truly ill, he arranged physicians, limited visitors, translated her words for others, and afterward told her she had been too tired to understand business. Victoria learned young that in some houses, cruelty wore clean linen and quoted scripture. What Nathaniel wanted for her was Lord Sutterfield, a widower old enough to be her father and proud enough to consider that an advantage. He had excellent land, failing teeth, and the appetite of a man who viewed young women as household improvements. Nathaniel called him dependable. Victoria called him, once and only once, intolerable. Nathaniel never forgave the word. Their mother died in March. 2 weeks later, Nathaniel informed Victoria the match would proceed before Christmas. She might have yielded then if grief had not left her one last gift. In the hem of a winter wrapper being altered for mourning, she found a folded note in her mother's hand. "Do not let your brother trade you for relief," it said. "There is money of mine he does not know I preserved, in case your father failed us all. Cedar chest, false board. If I am gone before you need courage, use mine." The false board existed. So did the money, though not enough to buy complete freedom. But it was enough for passage, for modest clothing plain enough not to attract notice, and for time. Most precious of all, it was proof that her mother had not been as powerless as the house preferred to remember. Victoria took the money, one miniature portrait of her mother, and the widow's old reference letter naming her Clara Winters. She left before dawn 2 days after Nathaniel announced the reading of marriage settlements. He had called it betrayal ever since. Warrington Hall was no refuge from a romantic tale when she arrived. It was too sad for that. The nursery felt abandoned even when occupied. Slates were laid ready in the schoolroom and seldom used. The death of Helena Warrington had not only wounded the Duke, it had undone the household's emotional order. Thomas, once lively and curious, had begun speaking only when directly pressed. Eliza burst either into tears or muteness, with little between. Music had stopped in the drawing room. 1/4 of the rose garden had gone to weed because no one could bear to touch the beds the Duchess had once tended herself. Victoria had not known whether grief left room for a stranger. Then Eliza hid beneath the schoolroom table on the second morning and refused to come out for any lesson, any coaxing, any order from nurse or maid. Victoria eventually lowered herself to the carpet, described in exact detail the color of a thrush's egg and the sound rain made in city gutters versus country leaves, and remained there for nearly an hour until a small voice from the dark asked, "Mama liked thrushes?" Victoria answered, "Then we may begin with what she liked." That was how the work started. She did not attempt to replace what the children had lost. Only fools believed love could be duplicated by method. Instead, she made the schoolroom a place where sorrow did not have to behave politely. Thomas was allowed maps some afternoons, if he could explain the currents afterward. Eliza learned spelling through flower names, because flowers were the only things she willingly noticed. They copied poetry. They translated easy French fables. On storm nights, Victoria taught them a ridiculous breathing exercise involving imagined candles and stubborn dragons. Thomas pretended to find it childish and then used it faithfully. Eliza requested it every time thunder rolled over the west lawn. As for Edmund Warrington, he remained at first what grief and rank had made him: courteous, remote, quietly frightening in his powers of observation, and plainly not interested in emotional theatrics. He expected competence. He disliked sentimental over-familiarity. He mistrusted anyone who approached his children as if their pain were a stage for moral vanity. Victoria approved of him almost immediately for that. What she had not expected was how often he noticed small truths. The first time he entered the schoolroom during a lesson, Eliza flinched at the sight of him. Not from fear of him, Victoria realized, but from the raw ache of wanting him. Fathers who grieved often became visible only in bursts, and children felt each reappearance as hope and wound together. Edmund saw the flinch, paused, and rather than insist on authority, asked Thomas what book he held. It was a history of colonial trade. Thomas, into expertise, answered for 2 full minutes before remembering to stop. Edmund listened as if the matter truly concerned him. After he left, Victoria understood 2 things at once: that he loved them deeply, and that love had become difficult for him to perform without pain. In September, Eliza laughed in front of him for the first time when Victoria accidentally sent a basket of apples rolling down the terrace steps like a escaping cannon shot. Edmund stared as though some creature thought extinct had moved in the garden. Eliza clapped both hands over her mouth in surprise at herself. Victoria laughed because dignity had already been lost. When she looked up, she found the Duke not laughing exactly, but altered by the sight of it. It was the beginning of their truce. He asked her one evening whether the children tired her excessively. "No," Victoria said. "They tire themselves by trying not to feel in front of adults." His hand went still on the paper knife he held. "Do they do that with me?" "Sometimes." He nodded once. "I suspected as much." It was not confession, but it was the closest thing she had yet heard from him. By October, the house began to change in ways no outsider would have noticed, and every servant felt. The nursery fire was lit earlier because Eliza liked drawing by the hearth. Thomas began asking questions at dinner again, though never many at once. Mrs. Hargreaves, the housekeeper, stopped walking as if the floor might crack beneath bad news. A canary returned to the morning room because Helena had once liked birdsong at breakfast, and Eliza said perhaps it might offend Sorrow if they let the house remain silent forever. The Duke began dining at home more often. Victoria told herself this was for the children. It was also because grief, once slightly eased, became lonely in new ways. She sensed it whenever conversation held longer than expected. He would ask Thomas about a book, Eliza about her penmanship, Victoria whether French irregular verbs should be introduced before winter. Then a pause would come, and in that pause, one felt the shape of the woman who had once stood in those rooms and made them easier. Victoria never competed with the dead. She respected Helena too much for that, and Edmund's sorrow was too honorable to deserve intrusion. Instead, she learned Helena through the household. The late Duchess had restored tenant cottages after a bad freeze and ordered blankets made before the parish requested them. She had planted white roses where the west wall took morning sun. She had once turned an entire formal supper into a game for Thomas when he was 6 and terrified of strangers. Her absence was not the absence of decoration. It was the absence of climate. The whole estate still lived in weather she had once moderated. Perhaps that was why the children trusted Victoria faster than she trusted herself. She did not ask them to stop loving what was gone. She only refused to let grief become the only language left in the room. It was Thomas who first asked why she never spoke of her own family. They sat in the library window seat, translating a tedious French moral tale neither of them enjoyed. "Because," Victoria said, "some families are best handled the way one handles nettles." "With gloves?" Thomas asked. "With distance." He nodded as if this made perfect sense. Children understood more than adults preferred. Her secret might have held longer if not for a letter. One wet afternoon in late October, a parcel arrived from Williamsburg containing books for the schoolroom. Inside, hidden between a conduct manual and a volume of Plutarch, was a folded page in a hand she recognized at once. Anne. Her cousin wrote in haste, "Nathaniel has announced everywhere that you were misled and are in a fragile condition," she said. "He means to recover you before Sutterfield withdraws his offer. He has shown a copy of some letter claiming you confessed instability. I do not believe it came from you. Be wary whom you trust. He says he knows where you are." Victoria read it twice and felt cold from the throat downward. The false confession was clever. A woman could be dismissed as immoral. She could be disbelieved as ungrateful. But declare her unstable, and every refusal became proof against her. Nathaniel had learned from what he once did to their mother. That evening, Edmund found her in the schoolroom after the children slept, standing at the window with the letter folded so tightly it had nearly cut her palm. "Something has happened," he said. It was not a question. She had not meant to tell him yet. Habit made disclosure feel dangerous, and fear made concealment look practical. But there are ways a person can look at you that make lying feel suddenly exhausting. Edmund had that look now, direct, unentitled, serious enough that truth might still survive the room. "My brother knows where I am," she said. His face changed very little. "The gentleman from today?" "Yes." "And the marriage he mentioned?" "He arranged it. I declined to die by obedience." Something sharp flickered beneath his restraint. "Was the man violent?" "Not yet," Victoria said. "That was the privilege meant to follow the vows." For a long moment, Edmund said nothing. Then he held out his hand. "May I?" She gave him Anne's letter. He read quickly, then more slowly. When he finished, he placed it on the table with the care one reserves for dangerous things. "If he returns with legal claims," he said, "I must know the exact truth to answer him effectively." "I know." "Can you tell it?" She laughed once without mirth. "I have spent years practicing not telling it. That is rather the difficulty." He absorbed that. "Then begin anywhere that is still bearable." No one had ever offered her that before, so she began with her mother, then Nathaniel, then Lord Sutterfield, the settlements, the hidden dowry money, the false name, the fear of being caught on any public road. She did not make herself nobler than she had been. She admitted panic, secrecy, the use of a softened reference. She admitted she had taken money she believed to be hers without any witness to prove it. She admitted there were nights on the road when she nearly turned back because the world was arranged to punish women who left male supervision with luggage and opinion. Edmund listened without interruption. When she finished, the fire had sunk low. "At Warrington," he said, "you were not under your brother's command." The sentence should have been simple. Instead, it landed in her like mercy arriving too late, and yet somehow still in time. He added, after a pause, "And if he forged a confession of instability, he is not merely controlling. He is building structure around his cruelty." She stared at him. "Yes." He held her gaze. "Then we will require structure also." It was not a declaration of rescue. That was why she believed him. From then on, their bond changed. Professionally, nothing improper occurred. He remained her employer. She remained the governess. Lessons, nursery schedules, clothing lists, correspondence, dinner hours, Everything preserved its outward order. But within that order, another understanding grew. Edmund began sharing certain household concerns with her because she saw what children noticed before adults did. She explained that Thomas feared being sent away to school not because he hated study, but because he believed houses came apart when people left them. She explained that Eliza spoke most freely while walking and least while watched across a table. He, in turn, told her which tenant families were under strain and how poor yields had sharpened tempers in the lower fields. He allowed her to understand the estate as a living structure rather than a backdrop of rank. Because Warrington Hall had not expected a governess who could read ledgers, calm grief, teach French, and quietly restore order to a nursery half disarranged by mourning, she became useful in more rooms than one. Useful women are always in danger of being loved for the labor and overlooked in the person. Victoria knew that. Yet Edmund tried, awkwardly and with visible effort, to see both. He noticed when her cuffs had been mended twice. A week later, a proper winter cloak appeared among the household allotments, correctly recorded as necessary expenditure for a resident instructress, rather than as a favor. He noticed she often gave away her untouched tea tray when Eliza began to weep at dusk. The next evening, the kitchen quietly sent a second pot. He noticed she never sat with her back to an open door. That last thing he noticed and said nothing about. It was therefore impossible not to feel something for him by November. Not because he was a duke. Rank had frightened her often enough to cure romance of glitter. Not because he was handsome, though he was, in the grave and dangerous manner of men who had suffered enough to lose carelessness without losing force. It was because he had begun, in 100 unadorned ways, to make room for her reality without demanding it flatter him. The children noticed long before either adult admitted anything. Thomas asked one morning whether dukes were allowed to marry governesses. Victoria nearly dropped the grammar book. Eliza, painting violets near the window, said, "Anyone may marry anyone if enough people are upset first." Thomas considered this an excellent political principle. Victoria answered with what dignity she could gather. "Your lessons today concern French verbs, not matrimonial rebellion." But she blushed for 10 minutes afterward, and Thomas looked unbearably pleased with himself. Then Nathaniel came, and the fragile peace of concealment ended. In the library that evening, Edmund stood by the mantel while Victoria sat opposite him, as if giving testimony rather than confidence. He asked practical questions first: dates, sums, names of clerks and solicitors, whether any former servant from Lennox house might speak truthfully if compelled, whether her mother's note survived. "It does," she said, "hidden where no one there would think to search." "Where?" She hesitated. His face remained unreadable. "If you cannot yet tell me, I will not press. It is sewn into the lining of my workbox." He looked at the plain walnut box on the side table, then back at her. "You expected pursuit the entire time," he said. "Yes. And still you taught my children to breathe through storms." She gave a shaky little. "Children ought not suffer because adults are monstrous." "No," he said, "they ought not." When she gave him her mother's note and he read it, some deeper anger entered him. Not the hot anger of insult, but the cold anger of a man who has suddenly seen the shape of a system that hurt someone under his roof before he knew to name it. He planned to claim incapacity, Edmund said, then marriage. Once married, any remaining property in your possession would pass more easily into other hands. That was his design. And if Sutterfield is as old and unpleasant as you say, Your brother likely expected widowhood to solve matters within a decade. Victoria stared. You say that as if discussing estate drainage. It is only another management scheme to men of that breed. She realized then that Edmund understood coercion not as dramatic wickedness, but as administration. It was a terrible comfort. We will need your mother's correspondence, the account trail, and someone who can testify to the pressure, he said. If your brother returns with formal complaint, I cannot answer sentiment with sentiment. I must answer with record. His use of must steadied her. He was protecting her, yes, but not by turning her into an ornament of his mercy. He was treating the matter as one in which truth required architecture. Winter gathered early that year. The first hard frost came before the leaves fully fell, and the house drew inward around fires, lessons, estate books, and the discipline of surviving anniversaries. Helena's birthday passed like a wound no one touched directly. Eliza cried over a length of blue ribbon that had once been her mother's. Thomas erupted into sudden anger because a servant moved a chair from the exact place Helena used to sit while hearing him read. Edmund endured both storms, visibly exhausted by them and yet refusing absence. Victoria helped, not by smoothing grief away, but by giving it shape. She had the children write letters to their mother they never sent. She persuaded Thomas to catalog Helena's books rather than avoid the shelves entirely. She helped Eliza plant winter bulbs in earthen pots because hope was easier to trust when buried first. One evening, she found Edmund in the old music room where Helena had once played. He stood before the closed instrument as if he had come to settle some argument with silence and found silence winning. She used to sing while the children learned their scales, he said without turning. After she died, I thought if no one touched this room, I might not lose the sound of her so quickly. Victoria came only as far as the doorway. And did it help? No. There was such stripped honesty in the word that it undid her more than tears would have. Rooms do not keep the dead by being starved, she said. He turned then. Firelight caught the fatigue at his temples and the clear intelligence in his eyes. You say difficult things with great calm, Miss Lennox. Someone ought to. He looked at the pianoforte. Would you play? It felt more intimate than if he had asked to touch her. So she played a French air Helena had once marked in a music folio. Eliza appeared on the landing before the second page. Thomas came after. Edmund did not move from where he stood. When the piece ended, Eliza asked for another, and another after that. By Christmas Eve, the music room was no longer a mausoleum. Nathaniel sent his first formal letter after Twelfth Night. He addressed it not to Victoria, but to Edmund, which told them all they needed to know about his view of the world. He accused Warrington Hall of harboring a female dependent suffering from nervous disorder and susceptible to delusion. He requested her immediate return to the guardianship of her natural family to prevent further scandal. He further implied that any gentleman who obstructed such restoration exposed himself to gossip concerning the nature of his interest in a woman below his station. Victoria read the letter once and went white with fury. Edmund read it twice and grew still. He means to shame you by attaching his control to my honor, he said. Yes. And to shame me by suggesting your presence here has already become improper. Yes. He folded the letter with exquisite precision. Then he has made a tactical error. What error? She asked. He assumes I prize gossip above justice. The reply Edmund sent was devastating in its civility. He informed Mr. Lennox that Miss Victoria Lennox presently serving in his household under a name adopted for reasons she would explain if and when she chose, had made no request for removal, showed no sign of incapacity beyond a comprehensible aversion to coercive male relatives, and would not be surrendered into private custody like disputed freight. If Mr. Lennox wished to advance claims, he might do so through proper channels and with evidence. Mr. Price, the butler, who sealed the letter, later told Mrs. Hargreaves he had never enjoyed wax more. Nathaniel answered by returning in person and by seeking a hearing. Once the challenge became formal, truth began gathering allies. Victoria retrieved her mother's original note from the workbox lining and gave it to Edmund. He arranged discreet inquiry through a magistrate from the neighboring county rather than their own, where Lennox influence sat too comfortably among pews and clerks. Mrs. Fenner, the elderly seamstress who had altered mourning clothes after Mrs. Lennox's death, sent word that Victoria's mother had indeed spoken anxiously of being used to settle accounts after death. Anne agreed, through shaking but determined letters, to testify that Lord Sutterfield's offer had been pursued against Victoria's repeated objections. Most surprising of all, Mr. Bell, the former Lennox steward dismissed 6 months earlier for supposed sloppiness, was found in Williamsburg and proved willing to state under oath that Nathaniel had transferred certain sums from his mother's private jointure funds into general estate relief columns shortly before pressing the marriage. The structure was growing. What Victoria had not expected was how deeply the confrontation in the hall affected the children. Thomas became vigilant to the point of sleeplessness for several nights after Nathaniel's visit, checking door latches under pretense of fetching water. Eliza asked twice whether brothers were allowed by law to own sisters. "No," Victoria said. "They merely behave as though law were written in their handwriting." Eliza found that both alarming and clarifying. Then a subtler shift came. The children, who loved Victoria as children love the person who restores safety, began fearing that their love itself might cost her too much. Thomas offered to say he no longer needed lessons if it would help. Eliza announced she could forget French forever if that would make things easier. Victoria knelt before them in the schoolroom and said the one thing she wished someone had said to her when she was young. "You are not a burden to the people who love you honestly." Thomas looked at her with the gravity of a child carrying adult thoughts. "Then why do people always send away what they love when houses get difficult?" She could not answer at once, because the question cut too near the bone. From the doorway, Edmund said, "Because some adults mistake fear for wisdom." The children turned. He entered, crossed to them, and sat, not stood, but sat, on the schoolroom bench, so his height would not overpower the moment. "I made that mistake after your mother died," he said quietly. "I thought if I became all order and no feeling, the house would hold. It did not. Miss Lennox helped me see that." Thomas's eyes widened. Eliza simply climbed into her father's lap as though some internal argument had finally ended. Victoria had to turn away under pretense of straightening copybooks because the tenderness of the scene was almost unbearable. Later that night, Edmund found her in the corridor outside the nursery. "You gave me more grace with them than I deserved," he said. "No," she answered, "only the truth." He stood close enough that she could see the tired line between his brows. "Victoria." It was the first time he had spoken her given name without title or distance. Everything in her stilled. "I do not know when this house began feeling less like a place of management and more like a place where life might still occur," he said. "But I know it began with you." She should have stepped back. Instead, she remained exactly where she was. "And I do not know when I began dreading your opinion more than my brother's," she said. "But I know it is because yours matters for better reasons." His mouth changed at that, not quite a smile, but the edge of one, made rare by sorrow. "When this is settled," he said quietly, "we must decide what honesty permits." It was an answer and a promise, both. The hearing took place in February in the long withdrawing room at Warrington Hall. Colony justice often preferred rooms smaller and more private than the suffering brought into them. The magistrate, Mr. Harrow, agreed to sit there because the matter involved a gentlewoman's safety, disputed funds belonging to her mother's dowry, and allegations of coercive marriage pressure better handled away from town appetite. Nathaniel arrived immaculate. Lord Sutterfield did not come, perhaps judging the matter no longer worth open association. Anne sent a sworn statement. Mr. Bell came in person. Mrs. Fenner, too. The room filled with that peculiar atmosphere in which domestic spaces become chambers of moral accounting. Curtains half drawn against winter glare, chairs aligned too formally, coals bright in the grate. Every witness aware that private habit was about to become public fact. Nathaniel opened with wounded respectability. Victoria had been emotionally unstable since their mother's illness, he said. The proposed marriage had been prudent, not predatory. The money taken had been estate property managed for household need. Her employment under a false name proved consciousness of wrongdoing. Any distress, she claimed, arose from female agitation, encouraged by persons eager to inflame her against the natural protections of family. Victoria sat through it with her hands folded one over the other, so tightly her knuckles hurt. Then Mr. Harrow asked whether she wished to answer. She rose. For years, Nathaniel had spoken over women because he understood interruption creates doubt more quickly than logic. He tried once now. "Victoria is imaginative." Mr. Harrow lifted one hand. "You will remain silent while your sister speaks." The word sister, spoken by another man and not as a claim, nearly undid her. So she chose not drama, but sequence. She described Lord Sutterfield plainly. She described refusing him plainly. She described her mother's hidden note, the false bottom chest, the money preserved from her own dowry portion, and the pattern by which Nathaniel had begun calling women unstable whenever obedience failed. She described the forged letter of confession. She described fear without ornament, because ornament would only comfort the people eager to dismiss it. Then Mr. Bell opened the account books. There, under sober ink and estate headings, lay the transfer. Small enough to be hidden among practical entries, clear enough, once pointed out, to reveal intent. Nathaniel had moved sums from their mother's private funds to create a picture of household strain, then cited that strain when pressing the marriage with Sutterfield. Anne's statement followed, Mrs. Fenner's. Then the letter from Anne warning that Nathaniel meant to recover Victoria by claiming instability. Piece by piece, the picture sharpened. Not a brother acting from concern, a manager of female compliance who had mistaken habit for law. Nathaniel held together longer than Victoria expected. He denied interpretation. He mocked memory. He suggested women embroidered insult when ordinary authority displeased them. Then Mr. Harrow asked him a simple question. If your sister's marriage was so entirely for her good, why was concealment required? Why the forged confession? Why not persuasion alone? Nathaniel answered too quickly. Because some women are too foolish to know what preserves them. The room went still. It was such a small sentence. That was the horror of it. Cruel systems often expose themselves not in grand declarations, but in one moment of impatience, when a man forgot to disguise contempt as duty. Victoria saw Mr. Harrow's expression alter. So did Edmund. So did every servant standing discreetly near the wall. When judgment came, it was not theatrical. Colony justice rarely was. Mr. Harrow ruled that the money at issue had not been proven theft by Victoria, but rather improperly absorbed by Nathaniel from funds with legitimate maternal claim. He ruled further that no evidence supported incapacity, that any attempt to compel Victoria's return through private force would be regarded as harassment, and that Lord Sutterfield's proposed arrangement, in light of the testimony, bore marks of coercive design unfit for enforcement. Nathaniel did not shout. He did something colder. He looked at Victoria with naked hatred, as though the true obscenity in the room was not what he had attempted, but that she had forced it into language. Edmund stepped forward then, not dramatically, simply decisively. "You will leave Warrington Land now," he said, "and if you trouble Miss Lennox again, you will not find me patient." It was not rank that made Nathaniel obey. It was the belated realization that here, at last, he stood among people who no longer mistook his confidence for right. He left without bowing. No one watched the door after it closed. They watched Victoria. The triumph she felt was not bright. It was steadier than that, heavier, almost holy in its exhaustion. She had spoken in her own name and survived the sound of it. That evening the house changed, not loudly. Quiet fires never moved loudly at its most important moments. But something in Warrington Hall unclenched. Thomas laughed at supper without covering it. Eliza asked if they might have music after pudding. Mrs. Hargreaves ordered more candles to the morning room, as if brightness were no longer an insult to memory. Even the servants crossed passages with less caution. Victoria stood alone for a little while on the west terrace at dusk, one hand on the cold stone balustrade. Beyond the lawn, the river held the last brass-colored light of winter. She had imagined this moment for months as vindication, relief, proof. Instead, it felt stranger. Freedom, once won, required shape. One could no longer organize life around escape. Behind her, she heard Edmund approach. She knew his step now, slow not from hesitation, but from care. "You are cold," he said. "I had not noticed." "That is because you are exhausted." He came to stand beside her. For a while, neither spoke. Finally, Victoria said, "I ought to tell you, I never intended to deceive your household for selfish advantage. I meant only to survive long enough to think." "I know. You should still have cause to resent that I entered under a false name." He looked out across the river. "You entered under the only name that allowed you to remain your own person long enough to be found again." Her throat tightened. "Edmund." He turned toward her then, and because the hearing was over, because the structure of duty had been honored, because truth at last stood uncovered between them, he did not hide anymore inside formality. "When you came here," he said, "this house was surviving from hour to hour. My children had begun to disappear into silence. I mistook discipline for healing. You altered all of that. Not by replacing what we lost, not by asking us to forget, by restoring life where grief had begun to pose as loyalty. She could not look away. There, under sober ink and estate headings, lay the transfer. Small enough to be hidden among practical entries, clear enough, once pointed out, to reveal intent. Nathaniel had moved sums from their mother's private funds to create a picture of household strain, then cited that strain when pressing the marriage with Sutterfield. Anne's statement followed, Mrs. Fenner's. Then the letter from Anne warning that Nathaniel meant to recover Victoria by claiming instability. Piece by piece, the picture sharpened. Not a brother acting from concern. A manager of female compliance who had mistaken habit for law. Nathaniel held together longer than Victoria expected. He denied interpretation. He mocked memory. He suggested women embroidered insult when ordinary authority displeased them. Then Mr. Harrow asked him a simple question. If your sister's marriage was so entirely for her good, why was concealment required? Why the forged confession? Why not persuasion alone? Nathaniel answered too quickly. Because some women are too foolish to know what preserves them. The room went still. It was such a small sentence. That was the horror of it. Cruel systems often expose themselves not in grand declarations, but in one moment of impatience when a man forgot to disguise contempt as duty. Victoria saw Mr. Harrow's expression alter. So did Edmund. So did every servant standing discreetly near the wall. When judgment came, it was not theatrical. Colony justice rarely was. Mr. Harrow ruled that the money at issue had not been proven theft by Victoria, but rather improperly absorbed by Nathaniel from funds with legitimate maternal claim. He ruled further that no evidence supported incapacity, that any attempt to compel Victoria's return through private force would be regarded as harassment, and that Lord Sutterfield's proposed arrangement, in light of the testimony, bore marks of coercive design unfit for enforcement. Nathaniel did not shout. He did something colder. He looked at Victoria with naked hatred, as though the true obscenity in the room was not what he had attempted, but that she had forced it into language. Edmund stepped forward then, not dramatically, simply decisively. You will leave Warrington land now, he said, and if you trouble Miss Lennox again, you will not find me patient. It was not rank that made Nathaniel obey. It was the belated realization that here, at last, he stood among people who no longer mistook his confidence for right. He left without bowing. No one watched the door after it closed. They watched Victoria. The triumph she felt was not bright. It was steadier than that, heavier, almost holy in its exhaustion. She had spoken in her own name and survived the sound of it. That evening the house changed. Not loudly. Quiet fires never moved loudly at its most important moments. But something in Warrington Hall unclenched. Thomas laughed at supper without covering it. Eliza asked if they might have music after pudding. Mrs. Hargreaves ordered more candles to the morning room, as if brightness were no longer an insult to memory. Even the servants crossed passages with less caution. Victoria stood alone for a little while on the west terrace at dusk, one hand on the cold stone balustrade. Beyond the lawn, the river held the last brass-colored light of winter. She had imagined this moment for months as vindication, relief, proof. Instead, it felt stranger. Freedom, once won, required shape. One could no longer organize life around escape. Behind her, she heard Edmund approach. She knew his step now, slow not from hesitation, but from care. "You are cold," he said. "I had not noticed." "That is because you are exhausted." He came to stand beside her. For a while, neither spoke. Finally, Victoria said, "I ought to tell you, I never intended to deceive your household for selfish advantage. I meant only to survive long enough to think." "I know. You should still have cause to resent that I entered under a false name." He looked out across the river. "You entered under the only name that allowed you to remain your own person long enough to be found again." Her throat tightened. "Edmund." He turned toward her then, and because the hearing was over, because the structure of duty had been honored, because truth at last stood uncovered between them, he did not hide any more inside formality. "When you came here," he said, "this house was surviving from hour to hour. My children had begun to disappear into silence. I mistook discipline for healing. You altered all of that. Not by replacing what we lost, not by asking us to forget, by restoring life where grief had begun to pose as loyalty." She could not look away. "I can offer you a reference," he went on, and something almost wry entered his voice. "An excellent one. I can offer you financial independence enough to choose any post you please. I can arrange lodgings in Williamsburg if you prefer distance. All that would be just, and none of it is what I most wish to say." The world seemed to narrow to the space between them. "What do you most wish to say?" she asked. He drew breath as if even now honesty cost him effort. "That I do not want you to go." There are sentences women imagine hearing in youth and learn not to trust by experience. This was not one of them. It carried no vanity, no possession, no assumption. "I do not want you to remain from gratitude," he said, "nor from dependence, nor because my children love you, though they do. I want you to remain because this is the first place in a very long time that has felt truly alive to me, and because every future I can now bear to imagine includes you in it." Victoria's eyes burned. "You cannot ask me to stay as a governess after saying that." "No," he said, "I cannot." A laugh escaped her through tears. "That is inconvenient. For the household ledgers, perhaps. For my composure, certainly." At that, he did smile, small, rare, devastating. Then he sobered. "Victoria, I would have you remain at Warrington Hall not as a servant, not as a tolerated dependent, and not as an act of rescue. I would have you remain because you choose a place in this family and because, if you can ever wish it, I would ask for a place in yours." She had been claimed before in the language of transfer, duty, arrangement, preservation. Never like this. Never as invitation. Never with the door left open. So when she answered, it was the first wholly uncoerced answer of her adult life. "Yes," she said. The word left her, not like surrender, but like arrival. He did not seize her. He lifted one hand and touched her face with such careful reverence that she nearly wept again at the difference between this and all she had escaped. When he kissed her, it was brief, restrained, and full of everything they had both refused to say too soon. From the terrace doors came a sudden scuffle. They turned. Thomas stood there, trying and failing to look as though he had not been watching. Eliza stood openly delighted. "I told you," she whispered loudly to her brother. "If enough people are upset first." Thomas rolled his eyes with immense dignity. Edmund closed his eyes once, as though appealing silently to heaven for patience. Victoria laughed, and the sound went out over the terrace like a bell. By spring, Warrington Hall had changed its weather. The schoolroom remained busy, though another instructress was found in due time, because Victoria's place in the household could no longer honestly be described by wages and lesson schedules alone. Thomas regained enough of his old curiosity to begin building a cabinet of shells and maps. Eliza stopped whispering her requests and began singing scraps of tunes in stairwells. The rose beds at the west wall were restored. Helena's memory remained where it belonged, not erased, not rivaled, but honored inside a house no longer organized around permanent dimness. Victoria wrote to Anne and invited her to visit without permission asked of any man. Mrs. Fenner received a proper order for new gowns and cried over the fabric like a patriot over liberty. Mr. Bell was placed in a post more suited to his honesty than his caution. Nathaniel, hearing that his influence no longer traveled as once it had, retreated into the brittle respectability of those who mistake silence around them for restored power. As for Edmund, he never again treated love as a danger best hidden behind management. He remained grave, disciplined, and exacting, but he learned to speak before loss made speech urgent. He learned to sit in the schoolroom while Thomas explained maps. He learned that Eliza slept better when stories were read in two voices. He learned, perhaps most difficult of all, that a woman could stand beside him without disappearing beneath the title he carried. On a bright May afternoon, months after the hearing, Victoria paused in the hall where Nathaniel had once tried to reclaim her and looked up at the staircase. Sunlight poured through the upper windows. Thomas was arguing cheerfully with a tutor about naval routes. Eliza was leaning over the banister, asking whether luncheon might include sugared pears if she promised to finish her copywork. From the library came Edmund's voice, dry and patient and unmistakably amused. The house had not gone dark again. It never would.